Hey everybody, welcome on back. Yesterday you were looking at the Ming Dynasty, sort of the strategies that they had used to gain and maintain power throughout East Asia. Today you're going to examine sort of the level of interconnectedness of the Ming Dynasty, specifically with the travels of an explorer named Zheng He. Now you might see Zheng He pronounced a couple of different ways. Some people will pronounce it Zhang Ha, and so on, but I'll just be pronouncing it Zhang He because it's more phonetic and it's kind of more closely to what you'll read it as. And kind of as we had talked about throughout the course of the year, that specifically when you look at languages like, Chinese, Japanese, other East Asian languages, even Russian, German, and so on, the translations into English can get a little bit fuzzy. So we're going to kind of stick with the pronunciation of Zheng He because it's, again, very closely related to what you'll see and probably the way that you'll read it as. And Zheng He was an explorer during the Ming Dynasty who really was a pretty influential figure, a naval admiral in the region of East Asia. So to start, I want you just to take a quick look at this picture or these pictures that I have on this first slide here for you. All right, so these pictures are images showing a bunch of different animals that you've probably all seen, you're all familiar with. And in the 15th century, the Ming Dynasty had this imperial zoo that acquired many unique and new animals, including giraffes, camels, zebras, ostriches, and so on. So I want you to think about, where in the world are these animals naturally found? Right? And I think that you'll kind of see that these animals are not naturally found in China or East Asia. Right? So that kind of tells us that the Ming Dynasty had some level of interconnectedness with the regions that these animals are originating from. So, for example, when we think of giraffes, we might think of Africa. So that might tell us that the Ming Dynasty had some level of interconnectedness with Africa if in the Ming Dynasty's imperial zoo, they have giraffes. Right? So this is just kind of one example of evidence that we can use to kind of determine, what regions of the world did the Ming Dynasty come into contact with. Right? And this is sort of one small way that historians can sort of get a hint or a view into the relationships of the Ming Dynasty. Okay, so again, we're kind of just continuing to push forward. We're really focusing on the Ming Dynasty like you looked at yesterday. This is just kind of another timeline here showing you, some of the dynasties that we had talked about. I know in my last PowerPoint for you yesterday, we kind of examined this a little bit more in depth, but we're really focusing on the Ming Dynasty and their level of interconnectedness. Right, so like I had talked about yesterday, the Ming Dynasty was restoring Chinese rule to China, right? Overthrowing the Yuan dynasty, which was Mongol in origin. So this is really restoring essentially Chinese national rule to the region that we know as China. Right? And throughout history, China traditionally thought of itself as something called the Middle Kingdom, right? This very ethnocentric sort of viewpoint, meaning that they saw their civilization as the center of the earth, sort of as the glowing example for what civilization should be like. And this is definitely going to be reflected in some of the reforms and actions of the Ming government. Right? So the Ming rulers enacted many different reforms to improve the government. They brought back the civil service system or the civil service exam that we had looked at a couple of weeks ago when we looked at, the early Han dynasty and so on. Right? This idea that if you wanted to be in the government and you wanted to work for the government, you had to take a written test. And this would help ensure that the people who worked in the government were well qualified and were essentially able to do these jobs at a high level rather than just giving jobs out based upon, let's say, your social standing or how much money you have. Now, the civil service exams did tend to favor people who were a little bit more wealthy, who were educated, who could read and write, but it still kind of addressed that issue of now you had people in the government who were well equipped and well qualified to sort of operate. Right? Confucian learning once again became very important because the knowledge of Confucian classics and the ideas of Confucius were a key part of the civil service exam. So many individuals, many scholars would really study the works of Confucius, the Analects, his writings, as a way to make sure they did well on that civil service exam, they got a job in the government, and they could then hold a position of prestige. Okay. Now, finally, we do see the Ming government establishing something called a board of censors to eliminate corruption in the government. So there was sort of this definite focus on making sure that the people who were working in the government were not necessarily corrupt and that they were performing their jobs to the best of their ability. This is kind of a little bit of a review from what you talked about yesterday. We took a look at, or we talked about the overthrow of the Yuan dynasty, and we will start to see the Chinese Ming dynasty sponsor some voyages of exploration. Now, later on in the Ming dynasty, we will see them start to turn inward and start to become more isolated, seeking to protect itself from the outside influences that it saw as being very corrupt. Right? The Ming dynasty is going to start to see foreigners as maybe corrupting Chinese culture, Chinese ideals, the Chinese government, and they're going to start to turn inward. But for today, you're going to really be focusing on prior to this isolationist approach, really this age of expansion and exploration. Right? And yesterday we did mention briefly how China greatly affected the regions around it, the tributary states of Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Okay? So for today, our focus is really going to be their overseas expansion and exploration. And that all started in 1405 with this individual that you see on the right here, a Chinese admiral named Zheng He. So Zheng He set out with a fleet of ships, and his ships were significantly larger than those that were used by the Europeans at this time. And you'll see that a little bit more clearly in the video that you're going to take a look at today. And his goal was to really promote Chinese trade and also collect tribute from less powerful lands. So by sort of exploring East Asia, down into South Asia, even as far as the Middle East and Eastern Africa, Zheng He is going to bring back not only wealth, but goods and products from these other regions to help expand Chinese prestige, and also as a way to sort of show off the power of the Ming dynasty. So between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He undertook about 7 voyages, and he had a huge armada or fleet of ships that are going to cross the China Sea and venture west to South Asia, the Middle East, Arabia, and East Africa. So this fleet consisted of giant ships that were escorted by dozens of supply ships, water tankers, transport for horses, and patrol boats. It was really like a big floating navy. So it was really impressive in its size. And there were about 27,000, by most estimates, 27,000 sailors and soldiers. And the largest of the ship was thought to be over 400 feet long. And just for comparison, Christopher Columbus's largest ship was about 90 feet long. And Christopher Columbus's crew was about 90 people, right? So we're looking at a huge floating navy that is going to really be expanding Chinese influence and power over East Asia. So after Zheng He's death in 1433, the Ming Emperor is going to ban the building of large ocean-going ships, and China is going to start to halt its voyages of exploration. So the reason for this was because of some economic issues, and also, like we had talked before, about this fear of foreign corrupting influence on Chinese culture. So these voyages by Zheng He not only were influential in expanding Chinese power, but they were also very, very costly. And there were many people within the Ming government who felt like the cost of these voyages was not necessarily being recouped or was worth it. They weren't getting a return on their investment, if you will. All right. And kind of combined with this idea of China as the Middle Kingdom, China as the center of civilization, there was this growing belief that there was nothing out there that China didn't already possess. So there was no good, no product from anywhere in the world that was needed because China had already possessed it. So there was this sort of focus towards turning inward and isolating from the rest of the world. So we will start to see, after Zheng He's death, Ming leaders severely restrict foreign trade, kind of having this belief that European goods were inferior, they were not as good as Chinese-made products. But we will see sort of a limited trade at several coastal trading cities that imperial officials in the Ming government are going to supervise very, very strictly. And we'll kind of get back to this later on, really for most of you, probably next year. when you look at sort of the European desire to trade with China and open up China's ports for trade, sort of shifting away from this very restricted, you can say, rules and regulations of the Ming Dynasty. Okay. But for today, your task is to really examine this age of exploration, really examine what it was all about. So in folder 5.4, you have a video that's going to give you a little bit of context and background about the size of Zheng He's fleets, a little bit about him, and you'll kind of see the exploits and sort of how really impressive this armada was in size. And then you're also going to go ahead and look in folder 5.4, and you'll see a couple of documents that are going to help you sort of walk through some of the accomplishments of Zheng He and some of the, I guess you could say, important enduring effects of his voyages. And that'll kind of take you through your work for today. All right. Going forward, we're going to do a little check-in next class. You're going to be working on a very, very short castle learning, just for me to kind of see where you're at and just kind of check in with you, you know, and see kind of how you're progressing a little bit. Okay. As always, any questions, please feel free to send me an email. I'm always here to help, and good luck with your work.